So we come this morning to almost the crux of this man Jacob's life in Genesis chapter 32. And it's a chapter again which we know well. And we want to look at this man Jacob this morning and see what this episode brings to the development of his character. And that's what we've been looking at, haven't we, over the process of the weekend, that Jacob's life provides a roadmap almost of the growth of a disciple. And hopefully you've been able to see yourselves in the life of this man Jacob. I know I certainly have over the process of looking at his life. Now, we saw last night that he left Syria behind and he made a conscious decision that he didn't want that life, but that he wanted the life which God had for him and that he saw his father and his grandfather had. That's the life that he wanted. And that meant travelling back to Bethel, back to the promised land that his father Abraham had been called to. And God gives him a promise as he sets out. Look in chapter 31 and verse 3. God makes an assurance to him again. As he had done when he'd left to go to Syria, God reiterates this promise to him that he would never leave him, that he was always watching over him. In verse 3, and Yahweh said unto Jacob, return unto the land of your fathers. It's time to go home, Jacob, to the land of your fathers and your kindred. And he says, I will be with you. I've never left you, Jacob. And the road that now leads to your fathers, I will be with you there as well. I've got that ladder set up right next to your bed. And I'm with you every step of the way. Now, Jacob had started to see God working in his life. If you just look at chapter 31 and verse 7, you will see that he said to his wives, he says, and your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God has suffered him not to help me, suffered him not to hurt me. So he could see that God had worked in his life. Now, Jacob had sort of taken control. You remember the story of he set up those poles and he'd worked out a way and had schemed a way of getting the flock for himself. But God then appeared to him in a dream and said, Jacob, I know that you think that you've done all this yourself, but I did it. I was there the whole time watching over your life. I was caring for you and looking after you. And Jacob could now see that. He could start to see God working in his life. And if you look over at verse 42 of chapter 31, he said to Laban, as he finally escaped and left that man, verse 42, it says, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou would have sent me away now empty. But God hath seen my affliction and the labour of my hands, and he rebuked you yesternight. I've seen that my God has been watching over me. And Jacob started to see the hand of God in his life. But that was hard for Jacob because he was a man, as we've seen from the beginning, that liked to be in control. He liked to be self-reliant, to have things under control himself. And God had to teach this man through the course of his life to depend only on God. Only on God. In his life and in the circumstances of his life, and ultimately for his salvation. And the climax of that lesson will come in this chapter in 32 as he returns to his family. Now, naturally, brothers and sisters, I know for myself, I like to be in control. I like to have my life in control and know where things are. I like to rely upon myself, to have everything right. And the world teaches us to be like this, doesn't it? It says you need to be self-reliant. You need to secure your own future. Make sure your own financial situation is right. Secure your nest egg. Make sure it's all right. Be completely self-reliant. Be the master of your own destiny. to fix all your own problems when they come out. But we can't fix all our own problems, can we, brothers and sisters? We can't. And the biggest problem that we can't fix is the sin in our lives. And that leads to death. And all of us are helpless to fix that problem on our own. We've got no control over it. Only God can do that. And coming to an understanding of this and trusting in God for our daily lives and ultimately as the only source of our salvation is an essential step which we must come in our spiritual development. And that's where God will lead Jacob today, on his way home. And verse 32 says that he started to make his way home, finally, free from Laban. Jacob went on his way. He escapes that brutal man, Laban, who had worked him to the bone. But as he waves that man goodbye, he thinks about the other man that he's got to go and meet. And leaving Syria meant that he had to go and confront Esau. Big, hairy and scary. And last time he saw him, he wanted him dead. And he has to go and face that man. And God, in verse 1, assures Jacob that he is right next to him. Verse 1 says, and the angels of God met him. So God met him on the way, and the angels of God assured this man, don't worry, Jacob, I'm right there with you. I've got the angels of God right there with you. And verse 2, Jacob replies to that gesture that God gives him, and he says, and when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Mahanaim means two camps. And this gives us a little bit of an insight into the way Jacob thought about his situation. He saw God's camp and he saw his camp. And they sort of both worked hand in hand to get the job done. I do my little bit, and then sort of God comes in behind and he does his little bit, and we work together to get the job done. That's the way Jacob viewed things. And we can see that in this chapter. He goes out of his way to do everything he possibly can to secure this situation for himself. It's good to colour in verse 4 to 5, all the he's and the I's. Because Jacob works out this elaborate plan by which he will appease this man Esau, which he's going to meet. Verse 4 says, and he commanded them, saying, thus shall you speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob says, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and asses and flocks and manservants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I might find grace in his sight. So Jacob's plan to appease this man was, if I send some messengers to him and I tell him that I'm no threat to you anymore, I've got my own stuff, I'm not here to take your stuff. And in fact, I'm not your lord, Esau. And he's learnt that lesson, hasn't he? I'm your servant. And I regret what I did all those years before when I stole from you the birthright, when I should have waited for God. I'm your servant now, Esau. And please take these gifts as a way of saying sorry for what I've done. And so he sends the messengers away. And then in verse 6, they return. And look how they return. And the messengers returned to Jacob and they said, we have come to thy brother Esau, and he's also coming. And he's bringing with him 400 men. Now, that's not what he wanted to hear, was it? Now he hears that Esau, this big hairy man, is coming, and it's not just him alone. He's brought 400 of his men. And what does Jacob think straight away? He's coming to get me, and he's brought all this army of 400 men, and they're going to get me. And I've tried to appease him. And he's coming to get me. And look how he feels in verse 7. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. That word distress means to be narrow, to be squeezed. And he was worried for his life, wasn't he? And we find out later in verse 11 that what he was really worried about, he was worried about his family. He was worried about his wives, and he was worried about his children. And he thought they're going to come to some harm, and he felt stressed and squeezed and narrowed. And at some point, brothers and sisters, all of us face situations like this in life, don't we? Maybe you're facing one of those situations right now, where we face a problem in our lives where it's too big for us. And we don't have the solution. I don't have the answer. Maybe, brothers and sisters, it's sickness. Or maybe it's family stress. Or financial stress. Or maybe it's just a personal struggle with sin in your own life, which just seems so big and too overwhelming for you. That's how Jacob feels. He feels constricted. And so what does he do? Well, he does what most of us do in this situation. He runs these things through his mind in 1,000,000 miles per hour. And he thinks about what he can possibly do to solve this solution. The end of verse 7. And he then thought, well, what I'll do is I'll divide the people that are with me and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 bands. I'll split us up so that if he comes and grabs one group, at least the other group will be safe. And then he said in verse 8, and he said, and in most translations that is, he thought in his mind, if Esau comes to one company and smites it, then the other company will be left to escape. So he ran all these things around in his mind, worrying and worrying and worrying. And how often do we do that? At night in our beds, when we go to bed at night. And we lie on the pillow. And even though God said to us, I will never leave you, and I'm watching over your life in every avenue of it, we lie on our pillow and our minds just race about all the worries that we've got in life and how we're going to fix this and what do I need to do that and how am I going to do this and what am I going to do to get there? And that's what Jacob does on his pillow that night. And then he goes to his God in prayer. And I love this prayer. It's a beautiful prayer because it's an honest prayer. And sometimes we come to God with these kind of prayers, don't we, where we're really honest with God about how we really feel. But it's interesting, isn't it, where this prayer comes in the process of Jacob's problem. He goes to God in verse 9, after he's already tried to fix the problem himself, and after he's worried about it for days and days and weeks, and only after then does he go to his God in prayer. And how often do we do that? How often have I done that? And God is almost sometimes in our life like a backup plan. That once I've devised all my own schemes and my own plans about how to fix it, then as a backup, I'll go to my God and say, God, can you help me to make this happen? And that's what Jacob does here. He goes to his God in prayer. And he's very honest with his God. Look what he says in verse 9. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and the God of my father Isaac, The Lord which said unto me, return to thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. So he comes to God and he says, look, God, you are my God, the God of my fathers. And you said to me, you came to me when I was with Laban, and you told me to return. I'm only doing what you said to me to do. I'm not doing any different to that. You came to me and said, you go home, and I'm making my way home. And you promised to me, God, as he says at the end of verse 9, that you would deal well with me. And in the ESV, that is translated, you told me that you would do me good. But now I've got all this trouble. You said to me, God, if I did what you said, that you would bring good for me. But all I've got is trouble. Why aren't you fulfilling your promise to me? But you see, brothers and sisters, that's not exactly what God said. God didn't say, I will do good with you. God said, if you return, I will be with you. And there's a big difference between that. God never promised Jacob that his life would be free from trouble and that life would always be good and life would always be smooth and life would always be straight. But he did promise him that he would always be with him whatever happened and that he would bring him to the ultimate destination. And maybe, brothers and sisters, you've prayed like that before too. Because I know I have in prayer to my Father. We can ask God, God, why is this trouble come into my life? I'm only trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to come to the meeting. And I'm trying to read your word. And I'm trying to put it into practice in my life. But I've got all this trouble. I've got all these problems that have come into my life. And we can look at other people, can't we, sometimes? And we can think, well, their life looks great. And it looks like free from trouble. And they're living the perfect life of the Christadelphian. They've got everything in place and everything secure. Why have I got so much trouble in my life? It must mean that things are not going well. But that's not the truth, is it, brothers and sisters? Because God does not promise us that life in the truth will come without trouble. In fact, he promises us the opposite. He says that trouble and problems will be a witness that he is actually working in our life. And we've got to remember that. When we go through trouble, and in relationships or family or with our children, it does not mean that God is not with us. In fact, it means that he is. And that he's trying to teach us something through the process of what is happening. Psalm 34 verse 19 says this, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers us from them all. Think about what Jesus said about the narrow way, which we saw was the path that Jacob chose to go upon. That word narrow means to press hard. It means to squeeze. It means to be afflicted. The straight path, which Jesus also talks about, means a path that there are many obstacles upon. And that's the pathway, brothers and sisters, that we're all on. But God says, I'm going to use the circumstances of that path and the squeezing of those circumstances in your life to teach you, to refine your character, to make you to be more like me, to make you rely upon me. And that's what he's doing with Jacob here as he's squeezed and stressed about this situation. He's learning to trust in God only and not himself. And that's what God does in all of our lives. And you think about Esau. And we don't even read about Esau anymore, do we? Because God can't work with him. And he's on the broad way. And he's making his own journey and going his own way. And the broad way means that it's a way that's very accommodating. And he can do and go as he pleases. But God's not refining his character, is he? He can't. He'd love to. But that's man's doing his own thing. But when you're on the narrow way, God will work with you. And God will work with me to refine our characters. And that's what God is doing to Jacob. And Jacob asks God in verse 11, what he really wants from him in this situation is deliverance. Verse 11. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother and the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with his children. That's what he wanted God to do. And then when he finishes that prayer, from verse 13 right down to verse 19, he wakes up from that prayer and he goes back to plan 2 of how he's going to devise to get over this situation. And he thinks about another elaborate plan. And he gets all these presents in verse 13, and he lodged there that same night. And he took that which came to his hand, a present for Esau, his brother. So he says, look, maybe I can give him a present. And an elaborate present with all this stuff and all these animals, and I'll send him that in all different little procession. And hopefully as he gets all those things, he'll realise that I'm no threat. And again, Jacob is trying to do this himself. Look what he says in verse 20. He says, and say ye moreover, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with this present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure he will accept me. So he says, I'm hoping that what this present does is going to appease this man Esau. And that word appease means atone. I think I've worked it out to make atonement between this man Esau and myself. I can make it right myself. And he couldn't, could he? But that's what he thought he could do. Make appeasement between him and Esau himself. And so he goes to bed, confident that this possession of presents is going to do the job to make appeasement between Esau and himself. And so he goes to bed in verse 20 and verse 22 with all his family with him. But he can't sleep. And he tosses and turns on his pillow. With all that he's done. Is it going to work? Will I appease my brother? Thrashes around on his pillow. Until finally he gets up out of bed, takes the covers off him. He says, it's not enough. And he goes and gathers his family all out of his bed. He gets his kids out of his bed. He gets his wife, Rachel, come on, Leah, come on. And he gathers them. And he says, we've got to get you further away. And he takes that family and he takes them over the river. He takes them over the river and he puts them in the safest place he possibly can. And he thinks, now maybe they'll be safe. And then he travels back over the river himself. And we read about that in verse 24. And Jacob, with all his family back over that river, was left alone. And there he stood, alone, with all this worry about what was going to happen tomorrow. And he felt alone. And maybe you've felt like that, brothers and sisters, in the deepest, darkest problems of your life. Completely alone. But he wasn't alone, was he? He wasn't alone. And God had been trying to tell him this his entire life, that he was never alone. That I am always with you, Jacob. And that I will never leave you. And so God sends an angel to teach him this lesson about the power in his life, the God of Abraham. And so a man approaches him in verse 24, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. Now, Hosea, in those verses that we looked at in our first night on Friday night, tells us that the man that approached him was actually an angel. And whether Jacob knew that straight away, he looks around and there's a man and he starts wrestling with him and he realises that this man is an angel. And he wrestled with this man. Now, what do you do when you wrestle? I used to wrestle my brother Luke. He's about 18 months younger than me. And we used to wrestle. And it was like a contest of strength and will. And of course, I'm the older brother, so I always used to take him down, right, in these wrestles. And it always used to be that he would come to me, right, as years went past, as we got into our late teens, and he'd come to me and say, I think I'm ready, right? I'd say, I think you're ready, do you? Okay. And we'd wrestle, and I'd take him down to the ground, and I would take out the wrestle. And I remember it was only about 5 years ago that he came to me, right, and he said, I think I'm ready, right? I think I'm ready. I said, you sure you're ready? He said, I'm ready. And we wrestled down in the bottom room of Mum and Dad's house. We wrestled, and a couple of wily old moves, I took him down again, right? So I still hold the title. I'm fearful that he will come to me again. But wrestling is about a battle of will and strength, isn't it? And Jacob is going to be in a wrestle against God. And that's what he does here. He wrestles against this angel, which is really a personification of God himself. And he doesn't just wrestle for a while. It says he wrestled all night until the breaking of day. What was Jacob doing here? Well, this fight that he was in was really a symbol of what had been going on his whole life. He'd been a constant struggle, thinking that the way you attain that blessing was through his own strength. And so that's what he'd done with the birthright, hadn't he? He'd attained the birthright through his own strength and his own power. And when it came to the blessing, well, he did the same with the blessing. And with Laban, with his own schemes, he thought that he was constructing and by his own strength, he would gain the blessing. And now here with the angel, what he's wanting is deliverance from Esau. And Jacob still thinks that the way you get the blessing from God is in your own strength. But we don't have any strength, brothers and sisters, to fight against the enemy, the ultimate enemy. And Jacob had to learn not to trust in himself, but to trust in God. And so in verse 25, it says, and when he saw that he prevailed not against him. So the angel has been wrestling with him all night. And when he could see that he can't break the self-will of this man, because the angel's been toying with him, really, hasn't he? The angel could destroy him in a wrestle, but he's been wrestling with Jacob, hoping that he would come to a realization. But when he doesn't prevail against him, what does he do? He touched him on the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. The iliofemoral ligament, which I'm told is the ligament which the angel broke, is the ligament or tendon in the human hip. and it's the strongest muscle or tendon in the entire body. It has a tensile strength of 350 kilos. So that means if we got a little bit of this ligament and we tied it to the roof and we tied a piano to that ligament, it would not break. And it represents the self-will of man and all the power and strength that man has in himself. And God came along, and with the touch of a feather, he just went, ding. And he completely destroyed it. And Jacob collapsed. Pain instantly hit the side of that hip. Immediately, this man is completely helpless. He can't fight anymore. He's got nothing to give. And in that moment, he realised two things. He realised how weak he really was. How weak the condition he was really in. But the other thing he realised was how powerful God was. How big is God? He's huge. And all he had to do was just go, ding. And all my power was gone. And Jacob's response, when he understood, it was like a light bulb moment for him. When he understood that, what was his response? It said, he clung to that angel. He clung onto that angel with all his might. Hosea says he wept as he clung to that angel and he sought the favour of his God. And Jacob came to realise in that moment his utter dependence on God for everything. And as he clung to that angel, it was like Jacob was saying, I can't do it without you. I know now. Unless you're with me, I'm finished. I can't do it by myself. I can't win this fight. There's things in my life which are too big for me. And all of us come to that conclusion, don't we? At some point in our life. That life and its struggles and its pain are too big for us alone. And so we cling to our God. And this is what God was looking for. This is the secret to his strength. It's not about us trying to achieve it ourselves. It's about us realising that God has given it to us. And that all we need to do is cling to him in thankfulness for his grace. That's what it's all about. And when Jacob realised that, the angel said to him in verse 28, Jacob, you've prevailed. You've done it. You understand now. You can put all that past life behind you. Your perspective has changed. And so he says to Jacob in verse 27, what's your name? And it's not like he didn't know what his name was it? He knew what his name was. But he wanted to remind him about his former self, where he'd come from, and now where he was. And he said, my name is Jacob, the supplanter, the self-reliant, the one that takes things into his own hand and thinks that he can solve his own problems, and anything that comes up in life, he can do it himself. That's what I was. And God says to him, now your name is going to be Israel. And that means power with God. Now your strength is God. And now you understand that with him and with his power and strength, you can do anything because he is on your side. And it was like a completely new beginning for Jacob. And that is emphasised in the next verse, verse 31. It says that he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him. And remember, that's what happened when he first left his father's house, the sun went down. And think about all the lessons that he's learnt over that period of time in the house of Laban the Syrian, and all the things that have gone upon his family. And now this moment of wrestling with his God and realising that he cannot do it in his own strength. And all of a sudden, the sun rises again on a new perspective for this man. And he's going to walk out from this moment in his life with a new way of looking at things. And the end of verse 31 says that he halted upon his thigh. He became permanently crippled. And it's often, brothers and sisters, isn't it, what God needs to do? He needs to break us. And it's often, brothers and sisters, only in our brokenness and only in times of vulnerability that we actually learn to lean on God. It's only in positions where I can't do anything about this situation that we of necessity know that the only way we can turn is to God himself alone. And you know, David felt like this. David got to the point in his life. He came to this very same spot of Mahanaim. And it was actually in the period of his life, remember, when Absalom had taken over the kingdom. And he was no longer really big, strong David who had taken the kingdom and was ruling over everyone. He was a broken man, and his own son had kicked him out of the kingdom. And he was by himself, and he had to run out of that city by himself. And he went to Mahanaim. And when he was in Mahanaim, he wrote Psalm 62. And let's quickly turn there. This is the conclusion that David came to at this point in his life. He's in Mahanaim, the very spot where Jacob was. And in verse 5 to 8, he wrote these words. My soul, wait thou only on God, for my expectation is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defence and shall not be moved. God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength, and my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before him. God is the refuge for us. And that's where Jacob comes to. He knows that it's God alone that has won the victory. It's God alone that can save us. And there's nothing I can do to save myself. And that's the point that Jacob comes to. And then finally, if we come back to chapter 33, Jacob, as the sun rises, verse 1 of chapter 33, Jacob lifts up his eyes and he looks. So as soon as the sun comes up and this night has finished, he looks up onto the horizon, and who does he see straight away? He saw Esau came, and with him 400 men. But Jacob's got a different perspective now, because he's not alone. And he knows now that right next to him is his enormous God. And he's with him, and he's going to walk with him. As he approaches that man, the greatest fear of his life, he's going to have God right there next to him as he walks before him, and he feels so much more confident. And he arranges his family, and there's nothing wrong, brothers and sisters, with planning as he does, but now he plans in the way that he knows that it's God that's with him. And this enormous God is right next to him as he makes his way towards Esau. And look at him walking towards Esau in verse 3. Look what he does. He goes out in front of everyone. It says, and he passed over before them. Out in front, Jacob walks, not alone, but with God. And he bowed himself to the ground. And he did it 7 times until he came right near to his brother. So he went closer and he bowed himself down. And then he went a little bit closer and he bowed himself down. And he went closer and closer until he'd done that 7 times. And the last time, he bowed himself to the ground. And he looked up to see his brother. And what did he see? He saw this big hairy man with a huge smile on his face. And he ran to him. And he hugged that man. And he kissed him upon his neck. And he kissed him upon his face. And he said, my brother Jacob. My brother Jacob. And Jacob could see in that God had done that. That it was God that was with him. And he says that down in verse 11. Take, I pray thee, verse 10. And Jacob said, nay, I pray thee, if I have now found grace in thy sight, then receive my present from my hand. Please take my present, Esau, for therefore I have seen your face as though it had been the face of God. And he saw in what Esau did to him, he saw that it was God that was controlling that event. And that God was right there with him in the time of his need. God did not let him down. And he's reunited with his brother. In verse 11, I love verse 11, he says, have my blessing, Esau. I don't want it, it's yours. A man that had learned his lesson in life through the problems that he'd had. And after that event, brothers and sisters, had passed, we're told that he never wanted his family to forget what happened that day. And he never wanted any of us to forget what happened that day. And what he did is at the end of chapter 32, the last verse, he said to his family, right, he probably got them all around and they had a big meal together a couple of weeks later. And he told them everything that happened. And he said, as a way of remembering what happened, what we're going to do as a tradition in this household from now on is when we eat the lamb, which we love to eat, we love to roast it and put all the herbs on it, and when we get to the leg of that lamb, the sinew in that thigh, we're never going to touch it. We're never going to touch it. And that's going to be a remembrance of that experience that I went through in wrestling with God. And it's interesting today that the Jews still do that. But they've taken it in the complete wrong direction. I think you have to pay $500 for a lamb, which the Jews have meticulously removed every single tendon from. But they completely miss the point. And the point that Jacob wanted his family to remember, and the point that he wants us to remember out of the experience that he went through, is that we need to learn and to trust and to rely in our God and not ourselves. We need to rely on our God not only in our daily life, with all the circumstances that come upon it, but we need to, brothers and sisters, rely upon God 100% for our salvation. Because we can't do it alone. And I think sometimes, I know for myself, it's easy to have the perspective of Jacob, as if what we're doing in life is we're sort of living 80% of our life in the truth, or 80, 90%, we're nearly there, we're doing all the right things, and then God's just coming along and fixing the rest of the 10% for us. That's not how it's working at all. God has done everything for us. And without him, we are nothing. And he has provided salvation. And not ourselves. Him and him alone. Let's go finally to Psalm 37, where the psalmist beautifully summarises this. We've already been in this psalm and we've seen that it talks about Jacob and Esau. But the last few verses of this psalm talk about how God and how we are all saved, and it's not ourselves, it is God. Verse 39 and 40 says this. Actually, we'll read from verse 37 because this picks up our Jacob. Mark the perfect man and behold the upright. That's Jacob, isn't it? For the end of that man is peace. God's got a plan with that type of man. But the transgressors shall he shall be destroyed altogether, and the end of the wicked shall be cut off. And unfortunately, that was Esau. But here's the key, brothers and sisters, to the salvation of the righteous. But the salvation of the righteous is of Yahweh. He is their strength in the time of trouble. And Yahweh shall help them and deliver them. He shall deliver them from the wicked and save them because they trust in him.